Well, welcome everyone to Powder River Basin Resource Council's Healthy Soils webinar. I am Robin Engelhart Bagley. I am with Powder River Basin Resource Council. And tonight we also have Penny Vance with Powder River. She is in the background. She's going to be monitoring the questions box, and then we will take care of questions at the end. First, just a little bit about Powder River. We were founded in 1973. And we are a family agriculture and conservation organization. And Powder River members are family farmers and ranchers and concerned citizens who are committed to conservation of our unique land, mineral, water, and clean air resources. This evening, we have two presenters that are from our neck of the woods. We have Caitlin Price Youngquist and John Brown. And after their presentations, we will follow up with a question and answer period, and we will end at 7:30. So we're going to start with one, and they will present, and then the other will present, and we'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back for question and answers. So there is a question box for you, and you can enter your questions at any time. You just type them in the box. Anytime during that, and we will take questions at the end. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And if we can't get through all of them, John and Caitlin's information is going to be on the last slide at the end of the session, and they will, you'll be able to contact them if you have specific questions for them. There is a chat box, but please don't use it. We would like to keep it quiet during the webinar so we don't distract from the presenters. And we also have handouts with resources in them. They are downloadable, and they're also on the Powder River Basin Resource Council website, but you can download them right from here. This evening, our presenters will focus primarily on the practical application of soil restoration in your gardens and fields and pastures. All right, our first presenter tonight is Caitlin Price Youngquist. She is an agricultural extension educator for the University of Wyoming. She's based in Worland. She frequently presents on applying sustainable agriculture methods with particular expertise in composting, including vermicomposting, which is worms, and soil health, Wyoming soils, pasture management, no-till methods, cover crops, and mulching. Our next presenter is John Brown, and John stopped sharing his webcam, but you saw him there a minute ago. John is from Shepherd and Helena, Montana. He's dedicated much of his life to utilizing organic material through biology and diversity to build healthy soils on his own land and that of other farmers and ranchers. He says building healthy soils means higher yields, better water storage, drought resistance, reduced erosion, healthier food, and increased carbon storage. He relies on 6 principles that guide his soil health methods and can be applied by anyone interested in improving their soil. Before I turn the workshop over to Caitlin, a quick reminder, you can submit your questions at any time in the question box, and we will get to them in the question and answer period. All right, now for our first presenter, welcome, Caitlin. I'm going to turn this over to you. So just give us a second while we switch.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I think everyone can probably see my screen now.
Yes, we sure can.
Yes. So thank you for the invitation to participate, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the webinar and hearing what John Brown has to say as well. And one thing that I really enjoy sharing with folks is helping people understand some of the biology and the science of healthy soils. And so having a really good understanding of the biological systems especially can help us really manage better. And then also I'll talk a little bit about monitoring, some of the simple ways that you can monitor changing soil health in your fields or in your garden. So I think one of the interesting things to think about when we talk about health or soil health is health specifically. So what does that mean? What does health mean? And if you look it up in the dictionary, one of the definitions is the capacity to function. I think that's a really useful definition. So if we're talking about soil health, then the capacity to function is an important piece of that. So a healthy soil is a functioning, highly functioning soil. In terms of plant, animal, and human health, biological productivity, and environmental quality. So all of these factors fit into a broad definition of soil health and high functioning soil. Resiliency is another way to talk about it, to think about it. Would you hold on just a minute? I'm sorry, somebody's knocking on my window out here. I don't know who it is. Sorry. So resiliency is an important piece of it, right, as well. And being able to be resilient in the face of challenges. So that may be things like drought or compaction, erosion, a disease, right? Any of those things. So a healthy soil or a healthy system, right? Any sort of healthy biological system, we're resilient to stressors on that system. That could be drought, that could be plant disease, compaction, erosion, any of those things. The other thing that's important to think about with soil health is that it's on a spectrum, right? So it's a long-term management goal and moving from one end, from the less healthy to the other end, which would be the more healthy, right? So we're somewhere, your system, whether your farm or your garden, is somewhere on this spectrum of less to more health. And the idea would be to, wherever you are, is to continually move further along the spectrum, right? By implementing different combinations of practices and for healthier plants, lower input costs, more stability, less disease pressure, water holding capacity. And I know John will talk about some of these as well in his experience. But just think about that when I give these presentations talking about gardening and no-till gardening. One thing I encourage people to do is just start small and make some small incremental changes and watch how things change over time, and be able to watch on that spectrum how things change. So that's an important thing. And the other thing about changing things on this spectrum of less healthy to more healthy is that you have is to monitor and to make sure you're keeping track. So is the color of your soil changing? Are your plants, do they look healthier? Have your input costs changed? Have your irrigation management changed over time? And it's really, really important to keep those records, because it's hard to remember sometimes if you look back and say, well, I think it's better than it used to be, but I can't really remember. So making sure that you keep records as you're making some of these changes. So we talked about health, right? Resiliency, the capacity to function. What about soil? What is soil when we're talking about soil health? Really, it's basically a lot of old rocks and some organic material in the Earth's surface. It's also a living system of plants, insects, and microorganisms. The thin crust of old rock, we don't have a lot of control over, right? So those are what are called our inherent characteristics. So think about that a little bit like genetics, right? That is the soil you have. That's what you can't really change that. So wherever your place is, wherever your farm or ranch or garden is, you can't change the types of rocks, how old they are, what some of the chemistry is there, the topography. There are a lot of factors that you can't change, right? And then we have the dynamic system, which is the living system of plants, insects, and microorganisms. And this is really where, as soil managers, we can have a large impact. So that inherent system of old rocks, right, and some organic matter and biology on the Earth's surface, that changes over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, right? Thousands, millions of years. And the dynamic system can change within a system, within a season for sure, and within over years, and is greatly influenced by our management. So keep that in mind. As soil managers, we're managing the dynamic system within the constraints of the inherent characteristics of the soil. And there are 5 different factors that go into forming the type of soil that you happen to have, right? And it has to do with where on the landscape it is, what the climate is, how old that soil is, if it's a volcanic soil or a glacial soil. That's a whole nother field of study in a whole world, but I think it's important to just understand why the soil behaves the way it does, right? And that's one of those constraints that we're working with, especially in Wyoming, with some of our somewhat challenging soils and climate. Another way to think about the soil system is we're looking at the chemistry, biology, and the physics of the system, right? So what we are very good at in what I would call modern conventional agriculture is the chemistry and the physics, right? We're really good at figuring out what types of fertilizer, reading a soil test, applying a certain number of pounds of nutrients per acre, what piece of equipment to pull through the field, what types of equipment we need to do our field work. We're really good at managing the chemistry and the physics of the system, right? What we often are what we're learning, particularly through the study of soil health and getting better at what we're doing, is we are learning more about the biological system. And this is really where the magic happens, right? So the biological system, pulling all three of these things together, chemistry, physics, and biology, and really understanding how all three of these impact each other, and especially not leaving out the biological system. So keep that in mind as you are learning more about your soils and how these different factors fit together. The other important thing to remember is that the entire system is driven by photosynthesis, right? So the entire biological system of the soil is driven by photosynthesis. So if you could look into the soil and be able to see what was actually living and growing in there under a microscope, one thing you would start with is the plant roots, right? So through photosynthesis, those plants are taking carbon out of the air and they're putting it into their tissue and into the soil as organic matter, and they are feeding the biological system of the soil. So there's millions and billions of microbes in the soil in any shovelful of soil, right? So you have a lot of bacteria and fungi, different bacteria and fungi. Most of them are decomposers. A few of them do cause disease, but in a balanced system, most of them by far are decomposers, and they are breaking down some of that organic matter with different nutrients, and as they break things down and break them into smaller and smaller building blocks, they release nutrients for the plant. You have this picture here with the blue background. You can see the rhizobium there, the nitrogen, the little nodules in legumes that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, right? They take the nitrogen that's in a form that's not available to plants, and they convert it into a form that is available to plants. And so there's just a lot of going on in the soil. There just is a tremendous amount of activity. Another interesting little fact is that about half of all commercially available antibiotics originated from soil organisms. I've heard it described as chemical warfare underground. There's just so much going on, and they're secreting different chemicals to compete for resources. You also have nematodes. The nematodes, most of them are very voracious eaters. They consume bacteria, they may consume fungi, they may consume other protozoa, other microorganisms. A few of them do cause plant disease. Most of them, again, are just part of the food chain, so to speak. You have your slightly larger organisms, your microarthropods, your shredders, that sometimes they're called. So they're physically breaking down some of the organic material. If there's leaf litter or plant residue or manures, they're physically breaking them down into small pieces. And then those small pieces are then chemically broken down by fungus and bacteria. So that's the other piece that's happening there. They're sort of the first step in breaking down some of those larger pieces of organic matter. And again, so much of the organic material in the soil is not available. The nutrients held in the organic matter in the soil is often not available to plants until it's digested or broken down by all of these organisms in the soil. Mycorrhizae are another really amazing organism. They are a fungal organism, and their job, they actually form a sort of they are symbiotic with the plant, but it's actually they infect the cells in the plant roots. And what they do is they extend the reach of the plant roots into the soil to reach water and nutrients. And they're especially important in our really arid soils and our alkaline soils, our high pH, because they help the plants reach water, and they help pick up things like iron and phosphorus that are very immobile in our soils. So they're very, very important, and they do not thrive in disturbed systems or in systems that are heavily fertilized, because it costs the plant more to form an association with mycorrhizae to pick up nutrients than it does for them to pick up nutrients in a heavily fertilized system. So you'll see them in a low disturbance system with minimal synthetic fertilizer. This is a kind of a fun picture here in the lower left of a fungus that has set a little trap. It has swum into this little trap, and it's going to be eaten by the fungus. just an example of all the interesting things that are going on down there underground. So there's a tremendous amount of activity. It's not that different really than you think about the food chain that we're familiar with above ground that we can see. We just can't see this. So things are dying, being eaten, dying again. Nutrients are being cycled, and the plants are benefiting from all of that. And the carbon secreted from the plant roots and from decaying plant matter is the driver of the system, very critical. And then, of course, there's the worms. I've also heard these described as the ecosystem engineers. They are doing mostly vertical tillage. There's lots of different kinds of worms, but they're taking a lot of the decaying organic material on the surface and pulling it down deeper into the soil and making it plant available. They also are creating channels for air and water to move through. And as they're doing that, they're creating an environment that also benefits the plants. So there's a lot going on down there. Another quick, a little bit on mycorrhizae, just a fascinating organism. I would encourage you to do some reading and more looking into. We're still learning a lot about the mycorrhizae. More than 75% of plants form these associations, and they, as I mentioned, they expand the ability of the roots to access water and nutrients. They're also a really important source of organic carbon. They produce something called glomalin, which is about 15 to 20% of the soil organic carbon. And they're very important to stabilize soil aggregates and in low disturbance systems. They do not thrive in highly disturbed systems, but they're really, really important. There's even some research showing that they actually, and there's some communication that happens between plants through these mycorrhizal networks, and that maybe even some shuttling of nutrients in some cases. So they're very interesting. I would encourage you to do some reading on that and learn a little bit more about it. Here's just a closer picture. You can see the plant root and these little hairs, these little networks, and you can see how that would greatly increase the reach of a plant for water and nutrients. This is just another visual example of what I was explaining earlier of the carbon that is being pushed into that is being put into the soil through the process of photosynthesis. This was taken in a ditch was being dug for an irrigation line in a hayfield near Warland, and you can see down low the very sort of light color of the soil with very little aggregation, and up near the top where there have been plant roots for probably 50 to 100 years, irrigated grass here, right? There is more carbon, as you can see by the color, and more aggregation and more structure, and all of this change has been caused by the fact that it's been an irrigated pasture, right? This is an alfalfa root, this long one. And if you look closely around the base of this alfalfa root, what you can see is the difference between the soil right around that root and then further out in the soil, further from the plant roots. Then you can see what I was talking about earlier, where through the photosynthesis process, there's that carbon that is actually going through the plant and then out into the soil and feeding the soil microbes and creating a little microenvironment there around the roots. And you can see that happening. So if you ever get a chance, you're looking at ditches or road cuts are a great way to look at soil, putting in irrigation lines, that kind of thing. I would encourage you to get out and look a little bit. So as I mentioned, photosynthesis is a big part of this. We're trying to take the carbon dioxide out of the air and put it into the soil where it's useful, right? Really important. And a lot of this, the plant roots, particularly in a perennial prairie system, are a lot of the plants are sloughed off and regrow every year. So as those plants roots sort of die back in the winter, that carbon goes into the system and then they grow back again in the summer, right in the spring. So there's a lot of recycling happening just as plant roots die. And then you can see here on the right, this picture is what, again, you can see that dark color, that carbon is all coming from the plant roots there. And what happens is with increased respiration, which is basically all those soil microbes that I was just showing you pictures of, most of them are aerobes like we are. So they consume oxygen and they breathe out carbon dioxide, plants. And so what happens when we introduce a lot of oxygen into the soil all at once, in rototilling, for example, or tillage of some sort, you have a big spike in microbial activity, and they chew up a lot of that organic matter, decompose it, release a flush of nutrients and a lot of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So what you're really trying to do is increase the photosynthesis in the plants, which would feed more microbes, increase your pool of soil organic matter, and decrease the amount of disturbance that would cause you to lose your organic matter. So thinking about putting more into your savings account and spending less. This is a map, a relatively old map of Wyoming based on some of the soil types. And I want to tie all this together in terms of why we have the soils that we have and how they might be managed a little bit differently, some of the challenges might be. So the blue section on the map is the high mountain regions that were really heavily glaciated at some point, volcanic soils, cold, the alluvial valley floors, alluvial meaning the river valley floors. Higher up in the mountains where some of the grasslands, those high meadows, dark colored soils, highly productive grazing land, right? Highly productive grasslands. And remember, grasslands being a really important part of building productive soils and putting a lot of carbon into the soil, because there's more precipitation, there's more water, right? Snow and rain in the mountains, which leads to more grass growth, which then would lead to more carbon in the soil. The pink area here in the Bighorn Basin, especially, you can see the orange along the rivers, and then the pink on the Intermountain Basin and the foothills, really light colored soils, usually very dry, right? A lot of salts, in some cases sodium. Sometimes it's just dunes that are stabilized by a little bit of sagebrush. And it's very productive farm ground along the river with irrigation. It's heavy clay soils with a lot of fertilizer and a lot of water. It can actually be pretty productive farm ground, but it's a high input system. Again, Intermountain Basin and the foothills, again, light colored soils, usually dry, but it does not have the river valleys that we do here in the Bighorn Basin for farming. And then as you've moved further east, you get into the upland plains, sort of starting to get into the prairie. You have a lot more moisture than we do here in the Bighorn Basin. And then you have the forest and the grassland soils and the rolling upland plains, right? And as you know, for those who live on that side of the state, you have your soils they have higher organic matter to begin with. You might find them easier to work with than some of the soils in the basin, and mostly that's because there's more organic matter because of the grass roots. So this map is a similar pattern you can see, and this is the soil organic carbon levels in Wyoming. And based purely on climate, topography, some of the other soil forming factors, we have typically about 1% or less soil organic matter in the Bighorn Basin. And as you move further east into the edge of the prairie there, across the mountains, you get more rainfall, more grass growth, more photosynthesis, more carbon sequestration, and you maybe have 2 or 3% soil organic matter. And that is due primarily to the fact that you get twice as much rain as we do in a year, right? So those things are really important to notice and understand. And this irrigated system, now, if you have an irrigated system, you can speed that process up greatly by adding water to the system and keeping roots in the ground and keeping that carbon cycling. So one of the most important things, there are different lists you'll find of 4 soil forming factors, 4 soil health factors, 5 soil health factors, 6 different health factors. There are a lot of different lists, and the way that I think about it when I'm trying to think about managing soil and garden or on the farm is you basically want to increase the quantity, diversity, and duration of living roots. You have to increase the photosynthesis, right? And the diversity becomes important because of supporting a diversity of microbes in the soil, right? And that's the way Mother Nature works, is diversity. And when you have a lack of diversity, that's when things get out of balance, right? And then reducing disturbance is critical. One of the most important things we can do here. In the Bighorn Basin, we grow a lot of sugar beets, and inherently you cannot really have an undisturbed system with growing sugar beets. Even if you plant them without disturbance, harvesting them is highly disturbing on the soil, right? As you're digging them out of the ground. So we have a highly disturbed system with sugar beets here in the basin. And there's a few producers that are working on some different methods. But the most important thing you can really do is increase the quantity, diversity, and duration of roots and reduce disturbance. So keep those 2 in mind. And remember, I mentioned these 3 earlier, your chemical, biological, and physical systems in the soil, basically, and they're all connected, of course. When you send a soil test into the lab, they're testing primarily the chemical systems, your pH, your macronutrients, micronutrients. They can also test for just the % of organic matter. When you're monitoring biological systems, you're looking at crop condition is a good one. The plants don't lie, right? Disease pressure, earthworms, count the earthworms. Dig up a shovelful, count the earthworms, and count them every year in the same area and watch those numbers increase as you change some of your practices. And then physical erosion and compaction or infiltration. How does the water move through the soil? Have you been able to increase the water holding capacity? Have you reduced the amount of ponding on your fields? how's the physical structure of your soil changing. So keep all of those in mind as you're looking at your own soil or learning how to become a better soil manager. I think this is a helpful image here because it helps remind us what is going on in the soil and how complex it is. So you have these little tiny bits of sand, silt, and clay, which are the mineral particles of the soil, and they're all aggregated together in some way with some clay particles. You have the organic matter. Remember, the glomalin from the mycorrhizae are really important for holding these little aggregates together. You have some air and some water, right? When the soil is wet, those pockets of air have become replaced with water. When you have highly compacted soil, those pockets of air and water have been compressed, and there's less water and air holding capacity in the soil, harder for the plant roots to grow. So just think about that. It's a very, very complex system of a lot of different pieces in there all at once. So, you know, you've heard that phrase, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So even if you're just managing your own garden, or if you're managing on a larger scale on farms, your field observations are very, very important, right? And it's important to keep those records. So there are a lot of different ways that, different types of field observations. I have some pretty complete lists that if anybody's interested, I would be more than happy to share. You can send me an email and I'd be happy to share some of the other soil health resources along those lines, right? And there's of course laboratory tests. So this is a whole nother presentation in and of itself, but I would be happy to share more of that with anybody who's interested. The single most important thing you can do is get out in your field with a shovel and walk around, right? Dig some holes, look at the color of the soil, look at the texture, smell it, look for earthworms, look at rooting depth. There are just so many things you can do, right? Look, even looking out across your field, this is a good example in the Worland area. You cannot really tell where the road ends and the field begins because the soil in that field is so low in organic matter and in such poor condition that it looks like the road, right? And there are a lot of fields around Worland that you can see that. And then you can see the fields that are near a feedlot where they've been spreading manure, and it's a completely different look to that soil. So just noticing that, right, is a good one. Noticing things like erosion. You can see here where there was some heavy rainfall, and this was even in a reduced tillage field. There was some heavy rainfall and washed all this silt down to the bottom of the field. So look for things like that in your fields, in your garden. Look for what the soil looks like when it's been covered versus uncovered. This is in a garden situation. This is a heavy alfalfa mulch that had been left right here all winter, and this area had been left exposed. The mulch had kind of slid off the side of this row, and it was been left exposed all winter. And it was a great comparison because when you pulled that mulch back, you could really see the difference in the soil here where it had been covered for several months with thick alfalfa, and here where it had been left bare, right? And so looking for those sorts of things. And so this is what it looked like. This is earthworm castings here. Soil was darker in color. It was softer. It was easier to work. It hadn't lost its structure and been compacted and exposed. So look for those kinds of things in your garden. Dig around and just look where things look healthier and where plants are happier. Fence rows are a great place to look for that. Because maybe they get some of the nutrients in the water that you get in your hay fields, but they're not disturbed as much, or they're not as compacted. So just use your powers of observation and look for patterns. This is a great example in Hot Springs County. This is a ranch that had switched from hay production to more managed intensive grazing, and after just one or two seasons, these were two samples taken just on the other side of a fence. One section was still hay ground and the other section had been moved to rotational grazing. And you can see the color difference already, and you can see the increased rooting depth from managed grazing versus just a water and fertilizer regime, right? So being able to just notice those things, and this is where that record keeping becomes very important. So in this case, ideally a person would take a shovel full of sample and the photo every year at the same time and compare them and watch those changes. Color is really important. Just observing the color, again, photos can help with this. You can get some inexpensive soil color charts, and being able just to monitor and see as the soil gets darker, that's a good indication that there's more soil organic matter. Looking for root nodulation, if you're growing legumes, peas and beans, alfalfa, look for root nodules, the rhizobium that are fixing nitrogen. And the shape of the roots, this plant on the right here, so there's a corn plant. It is obviously run into some sort of restrictive feature in that field, whether it's a tire track or some sort of compaction there versus the plant on the left. So noticing rooting patterns and rooting depth. And then also how your soil falls apart or how it holds together, right? So the glomalin is very important for holding that soil together, and the organic matter, especially in sandy soils. And this is a very simple little activity you can do with different soils to see how they hold together. Now imagine the soil on the right would be similar to that picture I showed earlier of all that silt that had washed out of that field and down to the bottom of the field, right? There's nothing to hold it together. And just looking, again, powers of observation. So this is, we were harvesting potatoes the other day, and we have committed, this garden has been no-till now for 3 years, or 4 years rather. It's a commitment, and it takes several years. There's a bit of a lag time, and you got to really be committed, and it's hard at first, and then it's the most amazing soil I've ever seen. It is so beautiful. And if you look, you got worms, of course, and just look at the structure. So there are a lot of small and large pores in this soil, which allows, of course, the plant roots to grow. It allows some oxygen and water to move through that soil, provide the habitat for the microbes, for the insects, for the plants. So it's just a really thriving system now. So this is really your take-home message. Get the carbon in the soil and keep it there. So everything you do, get that carbon in the soil and keep it there. The quantity, the diversity, the duration of living roots, reducing disturbance, especially tillage and bare soil and erosion, right? So compost and manure and mulch can help a lot as well. But remember that photosynthesis process and all those microbes there in the soil, and really getting that carbon in the soil and keeping it there where it's useful and not in an atmosphere where it's less useful. So this is my contact information. I know that they're going to share it again later. I will be answering questions as we go in at the end of the webinar, and I look forward to hearing what John has to share.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was great information. I love the advice to count the earthworms.
That's a really fun way to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to count the earthworms. All right. I am going to, let's see, we've got John on deck. Okay. And so thank you, Caitlin. We're going to switch over to John now. And here we go.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Caitlin, so much. And thanks, Penny and Robin and Powder River Basin Resource Council for inviting me here to be with all of you. Caitlin, your knowledge and enthusiasm for soil is amazing. And I wish I would have known a little bit of what you know when I was your age. But there's way too much information, both with what Caitlin shared and what I'm going to be sharing, to do justice here. So we've both included resource lists to share with you. A lot to occupy your winter time. I'm glad you're getting it at this time of year rather than in March. So please use it, and I'd love to hear what information you find most useful and information that's not included here. And let's see, I'll get used to running this here pretty soon here. Okay, so why am I about this? This is my granddaughter, who's 5 now, and she has a younger brother who's 3. And so on behalf of my grandchildren and yours, and all of the grandchildren of the world, I do a little ritual every time I do a presentation, and it is to light a candle that reminds me why I'm here and what my heartbeats are dedicated to. One of the first pieces on the resource list is a link to Mac McCartney, and take a look at his presentation, and it will give you a lot more about why I light this candle, and it might inspire you to do something similar. Because we're being asked by these children and their children, Mama, Papa, Grandpa, Grandma, Auntie, and Uncle, when you knew the old world was collapsing, what did you do to create a world I can live and love in? What did you do? I believe what we continue here will make us more comfortable with our answers to this question. Let's see. Okay, so I'm really, I'm actually, I wanted to go back one here. Oops. I'm really not the one who is best suited for this presentation, though it's a great honor for me to be here with you. I and my people have only been in this region for 4 generations, counting some of the ones living now. Hardly long enough to see much and know much, especially when much of that time was in rebellion, being trained in ways of extraction and looking for enemies under every rock. We're on the land in the cities Tecoan and Absaluka country. Apologize for my pronunciation of them, and probably others unknown at this time, maybe 500 to 1,000 generations or more of accumulated knowledge and wisdom in deep collaborative creative relationship with this ecosystem. Part of it, not separate. Perhaps there are a few of them who would like to help us live through this bottleneck of crisis and emerge into realization of a reverence for all the beauty right here, inside us, in front of us, in the soil, on the soil, and above the soil. Beauty all around us. And thank you all for showing up to this soil celebration, because it really is a celebration. You can hear it in Caitlin's voice, and I hope you'll be able to hear it in mine. I'm assuming that you're here because you are not satisfied with the tools you have, the information that has been available, and the results you are having in your relationship with the soil, the water, the community, the food system, and the social fabric, the political climate, and the physical, mental, and emotional health of you and your plants and animals and family. And you believe there is more. Did that cover it for most of you? You hope there is more. And I bet some of you are scared too. Scared of COVID, scared of our reaction to COVID, scared of climate change, scared of the election, scared of the economy, scared of our unraveling social fabric. I admit it. I sure am at times. And when we have, and then, we may have guilt for our complicity in this crisis. Forgive yourself and ask for forgiveness from others. And when we have anger and rage toward others we think have created this collapse, forgive them too. Guilt and anger have taken enough of our life force. We have better and more important work to do. Early this month, Northern Plains hosted Bill McKibben at a conversation called Turning the Corner on Climate Change. Now, it doesn't matter what you feel about climate change. Some of you may have listened to him, and during the question and answer time, a question was asked, and this is one that's important. What can one individual do? You may have that same question, may even have asked it from time to time. I sure do. I ask it every day. What can I as an individual do? And he quickly answered. He said, the best thing an individual can do is quit acting like an individual. There's good news in that story. First, though, I have a disclaimer. It wasn't in my bio, but on my business card, it says I'm a wannabe microbe whisperer. That's not quite accurate. I really want to be a microbe listener. I have so much to learn from these unseen ones beneath my feet, on my skin, and in my digestive system, and so many other places. And Caitlin had some great pictures and discussion of what's in the soil. All those same microorganisms, or many of them, are in us and on us too, and they determine how healthy we are. So only recently we had the ability to see this root hair tip. This is a root hair tip, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But it's not just microbes that I want to listen to. I've been sitting with this presentation for a few days now because I have a sense that there's something. Well, not something really. It's a presence more that's eager to emerge here, and not just here. It's every place I go, and just about everybody I talk to. But I don't talk to everybody, so I guess it can't be universal. But it's everyone I talk to, and it may not include everyone here. But this presence is a potentiality that seems to me to be rising up out of this soil as it gives itself to us and exposes us to what is happening there. And this potentiality is full of nutrient-dense imagination that depends, as all imagination does, on the belief in a future. Not imagination born of luxury, but imagination born of necessity. And the future is so huge in scope that no individual imagination can handle it, or very few anyway. And sometimes that's paralyzing. Had we met in person, I was going to bring a handful of soil from north of the border where I live, but I decided against it even before we were shut down. You couldn't see what holds my attention, because the instant I take it out of its home, it is different. Many of the relationships that made it what it is would be broken. The story fragmented and lost. It couldn't tell its story. And Caitlin gave some good information about what happens when you disturb the soil. So a couple of years ago, I was with Austin Chereau, who's an NRCS agent up in Roundup, Montana. And we were in conversation about knapweed. We got into it a bit, and then he held up his hand and he said, "Hold it there. Wait a minute. Plants behave differently in community. And we've been talking about it and studying knapweed, just about everything else, in isolation." That got my attention. So Ralph Waldo Emerson has this quote that I love. It's, "As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The person who grasps principles can successfully select their own methods. The person who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." And then Thomas Berry, "All programs, policies, activities, and institutions must henceforth be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human and earth relationship." So if you thought I would give you a recipe for how to build soil, grow grass, and live happily ever after, too bad. You know, I've heard enough times when Gabe Brown talks and others about their success. They say, "Oh, they can do that up there in North Dakota, or they can do that in Montana, or they can do that in Minnesota or Iowa or Canada. But here in Wyoming, it's too hot, it's too dry, too cold, too hot, too windy, too clay, too sandy. It won't work here." And you know what? They're right. It won't work here. Anything Gabe tells you won't work here. Anything I tell you won't work here. But what if something would work? What if something you figured out would work? What if? Would you do it? Would you pay attention to Emerson and Thomas Berry? You know, as Gabe says, You wouldn't want me to choose your spouse for you, and you certainly don't want me to choose your cover crop mix or stock density for you. So I'm bringing a story I've been hunting for a long time, or maybe the story has been hunting for me, and I finally had a chance to slow down enough in retirement to listen to it and be found by it. That story in the soil from across that imaginary state line finally found me. This is what it's been telling me for the last several years. And this is, I used to hunt at one time. I don't anymore. Well, I do actually. I hunt for things like this. My trophy hunting, Nicole Masters there, as we're digging up some ground, looking at roots and seeing what the practices have yielded over the last several years of experimentation, trial and error, and weather and everything else. And so here are these roots that are beautifully aggregated, going down well, and making lots of room for water and air. And so this is an exciting picture for me, and one that I love to show. So we were looking under every rock to find and destroy enemies in the past. We're now finding all our relations in those places we were looking. The Sioux and the Crow elders have been trying to tell us, and many others, for a long time, that this is where we need to look. Would you say that this current relationship story, the economic, social, energy, environmental, political, cultural, food story is in its final chapters, as many people do? You might feel that. Do you feel its climax swirling around us? The news coming out of this story is not easy to witness for me as a grandparent. So last February, around a very local, nutrient-rich dinner, my host and I asked one another how we're doing with all these converging collapses. How are we doing with climate change? And neither of us was doing very well, and neither of us had been asked that before. So both of us said, we're feeling a lot of grief. I asked earlier about fear. Do any of you feel grief for the loss of life as we know it that accompanies the fear and anxiety for our future, and especially for our children's and grandchildren's future? So, I like to just stop, and when I think about this and feel that grief, just take a minute or a moment and take a few deep breaths and acknowledge really that probably no one else has ever felt these kinds of feelings on a global scale as we're feeling it now. Everyone around the planet is feeling this. And there are actually two stories that I want to share with you. Another one is in its early beginnings, but it's not so early that its presence can't be felt. But they're both stories of relationships. So this is another one of my trophies. This is a cow pie that is riddled with dung beetles. It's full of dung beetles, and it's something that we were looking for a long time. So people might not want to smell this so much, but after the second year, or even a few months, it's really, really wonderful to smell. I haven't tasted it, but I taste the grass around it, and it tastes wonderful, sweet, and so the dung beetles are going to work. But this didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen overnight. It took a couple of years after stopping using porons and wormers for these dung beetles to start showing up. So both of the stories that I'm interested in emerge out of language. It seems to me that relationships are housed in language. One of the resources I didn't share with you is Stephen Newcomb is an indigenous elder from the Dana Nation in Southern California. He has a book called Pagans in the Promised Land, where he shares the story of how we got here with language. Beautiful work, and I apologize for forgetting to include him on the resource list. So one of the main people that has inspired me in the last few years is a guy named Brian Schwimm. He's a mathematical astrophysicist or something like that. I don't know how they get those titles, but and separate to seamlessness is his journey from a universe where everything is a resource that exists for us to use and to use up and easily throw away what is left of the extraction process. In our trash, there are a couple of pounds per person each week on average at the curb. And yet, what it takes to get the stuff to us produces 2 tons of waste per week. And this is the story that runs the system we find collapsing. What if the universe is a caring one, not to be used, but to care about itself? What about that? Would the universe work for 13.7 billion years, he asks, to culminate in the ultimate consumer that we have become? I don't think so. And would it culminate in leaky roots? I don't think so either. This root here that we were looking at here a little earlier, this one is in ecstatic exudation, giving in joy from the generous sun through the magic of photosynthesis. This little stuff out here is sugar being exuded by this root hair out into the environment as a gift to the microbes, the bacteria and fungi, all the other stuff. Leaky? Are you kidding me? There's more going on than leaking in there. So we're in the Anthropocene. What defines it so far? Now, the Anthropocene is the geological time that can be identified as human related. And some people say it's chicken bones, piles of chicken bones. Others say it's terraforms. Some say radioactive material. Some say plastic. Brian says it's none of these. It's the expression of DNA emerging out of resilience to survive. So Brian was telling a story about a fishing trip that he had when he was with his dad just about to finish his PhD program. They were up in the upper Canada, walking along a river among a bunch of rocks, and every once in a while he'd reach down, he'd pick up a rock, look at it, turn it over, and drop it, and would hit the earth. Walk along, pick up another one, turn it over, drop it, it'd hit the earth. And he did that for a while, and he started thinking, you know, I'm the go-to guy. I'm the guy that's supposed to be able to explain what's happening here. And I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue. Gravity does not explain what's happening here. In a living and caring universe, this attraction, he realized it could be known as allurement, the same force that brings lovers together, that brings bees to flowers and truffles to furs. What would the DNA expression be in such a universe? Question struck me. Seeing this world as a living organism, collection of organisms, as probably the indigenous people would encourage us to see. So another amazing teacher For me, many of you may know, or at least have heard about Dr. Christine Jones. She shares what DNA expression might be, what that DNA expression might be in such a universe as Brian talks about. The sensitivity, I call it, rather than, she calls it quorum sensing. I refer to it as quorum sensitivity. Sensitivity rather than sensing. The sensitivity that the self that is becoming aware through us is not just our little farm or garden or ranch. It is the entire planet saying, I want to be aware, but I can't become aware without you. You are the organs of my awareness. Use these organs, these senses you have to see, taste, smell, feel, and hear your landscape, all of it. And as Caitlin was suggesting, this is really important information that you get, and keep track of it. Keep track of how you feel it, how you sense it. This is the principle that I want to bring to your attention, and why I'm taking so long to not tell you why I'm not going to give you a recipe for what to do on your landscape. Next principle, it is the principle that surrounds all of the other 5 that we've been talking about, and it is context. Whether you're a farmer or a rancher or an urban gardener, only you can provide that context. You bring awareness to your ecosystem. Some of you probably bringing Bob Kinford's low stress management to your cows and awakening latent herding potential. You can take that low stress management into the rest of your relationships too, and you probably already are. Microbes and grasses and garden and neighbors, community and family. You take this concept that, oh, maybe I can manage my relationship with less stress, and maybe these animals can help me learn how to do that. So this picture here is low stress management in action. The dung beetles are, you know, as I mentioned, are back on the landscape in reciprocity for the generosity of care and attention that the landowner has given. So Christine tells a story from New Zealand. Where she's from. She's from Australia, I guess, but this is a story from New Zealand. And she was asked by a dairy farmer in New Zealand, you know, what can I do? Everything is falling apart. The land is collapsing. Inputs are going up, and it's really not looking good. And you can hear this story on one of the links in the resource page that I have here. It's one of my favorite stories, where they're able to build topsoil in 5 months using diversity of plants and biostimulants. And it's just stunning. I won't tell you the whole story here because I don't have the time, but it stimulates the question as we look at how soil is in us and around us and all over, and every species produces its own signal. So the more species we have, these are called autoinducers. They're chemical signals that and when there are enough of these autoinducers in the environment, there reaches a critical level. They regulate gene expression in the microbe population, and in the plant population and the animals that are also in that area. So what can we learn from this? That this diversity of plants and microbes can produce this topsoil in a time that we've been told, I was told that it takes 100,000 of years to produce that kind of organic matter. So how are we similar? We both get nutrients from the soil. Soil exists outside the plant and surrounds the single cell thick, semi-permeable, I call it a juicy interface configuration because it isn't solid. And then we surround our soil with a single cell thick, semi-permeable, juicy interface configuration. We call this our digestive system. So there's latent or dormant DNA, some call it. Others call this 90% of our DNA junk DNA. Calling it junk should be a capital offense, in my opinion. It's potentiality waiting for a quorum. A quorum, you know, is enough in the room to make a decision and to take action. So we can be a part of that quorum by choosing to do so, to be so in the context we provide. When there are enough of us and we're diverse enough and we have the right stimulus, potential that never existed before can be awakened. And we just might be able to answer the questions from our great-grandchildren and say that we awoke to the power of being a community, communities of people, animals, plants, microbes, the planet herself, all our relations. And we acted on that awakening. We stumbled at first and we got better as we stuck with it. In the previous century, this decade of the 20s was called the Roaring 20s. So we're looking at this decade of this century as the Restoring 20s. So stick with it. Follow your curiosity that brought you to this little gathering. It is leading you to discover the beauty, the magnificent beauty in the soil, in our bodies and all around and among us. Let this beauty lure us into falling deeply, deeply in love with all life we are a part of. You know, you already experienced this and expressed this love for your ecosystem to some extent. Quit hiding it, quit holding it in, quit apologizing for it. Let this love be the context, the stimulus that awakens our collective potential to act in ways the world has never seen humans act before. Let this awakening junk DNA be our greatest and most generous gifts to the future, given like roots giving sugar to bacteria and fungi. So thank you all for who you are becoming. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, John. That was great. That was illuminating. I feel like my brain is exploding right now with ideas, and I really love the idea of less stress, because I kind of think all of us could use less stress these days. So it's probably a good principle to ponder. All right, we are going to, let me check my notes here and make sure we're doing things in the right order. But we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and we're going to go over our questions. So don't go anywhere, don't leave. We're not ending the webinar. We're just going to pause for a minute and go over our questions. And then we will be back with both Caitlin and John, and we will go over the questions. So, all right. And so thank you very much. Hang in there. We will be right back. Just real quickly, this is Robin again. If you do have questions, please enter them in the question box over on the left-hand side. Yep, we're getting a few in. So if you do have some more, be sure that you enter those in because we're going over them right now and trying to get organized. So if you have questions, now's the time to type them in. All right, we're going to get started again. I'm going to bring Caitlin and John back. And we have some questions. All right, and there's John. Okay. Right, and oh, we lost John. All right, we're all here. Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay. Well, we do have some questions, and we're going to get started. One of those is kind of like a basic one. How do we get soil tested? And then how do we get good samples? So I guess that would be for both of you or either of you.
I can start with that. So there are a lot of different soil labs around the country. We don't currently have any that I'm aware of in Wyoming. The one at the university is no longer open. There's a good one at CSU. There's some in Nebraska. So there are a lot of soil labs around. Probably your best bet is to contact your local extension office, and whether you're in Wyoming or another state, and they can help you connect with a soil lab that will do those tests. And in terms of collecting a good sample, you just need to collect, usually it's about 6 or 8 inches down for a garden. And there are some great videos. Even if you just look up some resources on how to take a soil test, you should be able to find some good videos on that. But you just take a composite sample. So across your garden, you might take 10 samples, mix them all together, and then you need about 2 cups of soil to send into the lab. And they will often give you, if you tell them what you're growing, vegetable garden, for example, or crop, they'll give you some basic recommendations on nutrients that you might be deficient in. But you can either use an organic or synthetic fertilizer, or you can use manure or compost to meet some of those needs.
Yeah, and then it depends on what you want to test too. Some people really want to know what the biology is in their soil, and so not all labs will test for biology. But before you take any test, or while you're taking the test, be your own lab. Look at it, take pictures of it, smell it, taste it if you feel adventurous enough, or taste the plant growing next to where you take it, and see what the texture of it, what does it feel like in your hands, and what's the physics of it. You can tell a lot of the physics of it with that as well. So don't give all the power of observation to a lab. You have great powers of observation. We underuse them by a whole lot because we don't trust them to tell us anything. And so that's building some of that trust and some of the relationship with that soil. You don't build much of a relationship when all you've got is a printout.
You can also try reaching out to your local conservation district. Some of them will offer some help with the cost of soil testing as well. Occasionally they have programs like that. So reach out to your extension and your conservation district and get out and get your hands dirty for sure.
Okay. Great. All right, our next question, and I think this is for both of you. Are there particular things I need to do to start changing my heavy clay soil?
Organic matter is really a great equal for your, if you, some of the challenges with heavy clay soil is that it doesn't drain well often, and it can be very compacted, and sometimes the water, some of the water that's in that soil is not plant available because of the way it's held in the clays. And organic matter, whether it comes from photosynthesis and plant roots or adding mulch or compost, will really help increase the porosity and build the structure in that heavy clay soil. And likewise with sand, some of the challenges with sand is that the water and nutrients just go right through it. What we might call a droughty soil, or a soil that just doesn't hold anything really for plant growth. And again, organic matter will bring it back towards the middle again, hold the water and the nutrients, and provide some structure to that soil. So organic matter, we have pretty high clay soils in the community garden here in Moreland, where we've been transitioning over to no-till. And it took several years, heavy mulch, adding compost, and just heavy mulch and plant roots as you can. If you can do a cover crop, that helps. Sometimes you can use some of the really deep-rooted cover crops, some of the radishes, or other deep-rooted crops that will really help break through some of the compacted zones. If you're working with hand tools, shovels, and in the garden, you can use a broad fork that can really help break through some of the compaction without actually inverting and tilling the soil. That can really help as well. But getting the structure, and the worms are going to make a big difference. But again, they need something to eat, which is the organic matter, and they don't thrive in a disturbed system.
Yeah, and on the landscape, the pictures that you showed, Caitlin, of the difference between high density livestock impact in the soil structure. I don't know if that was clay soil. It may not have been clay, but it would be the same in clay soil. That have heavy, short duration, high impact, long rest management of livestock is really powerful. It adds a lot of organic matter and biology in the urine and the manure of the cows, and stimulates the plants to grow. So that's a
You also, in the fall, if you're talking about gardening, and in the fall, you know, leaving a lot of the plants in the soil still in the fall. So you, instead of pulling everything out and tilling up your soil and leaving it bare all winter, mulch it really heavily, and you can leave a lot of things standing over the winter. Corn, peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, a lot of those have, and squash, a lot of them have really large root systems or sturdy root systems. And if you leave them in the garden over the winter, and then you can pull them out in the spring and look at them, and you'll see the incredible amount of life that's just around those roots as they're decomposing through the winter. It's really, sometimes you can pull them out and you'll just see just massive worms around them. And they also provide habitat for the bugs and different insects on top of the soil too. But just keep that in mind, letting things be a little more wild maybe, and letting them go through that process as Mother Nature might have intended.
Yeah, great.
Great, and I feel bad now because I pulled up my squash vines, so
Okay.
I will do better next year.
That's okay. Right. Sometimes I'll just cut them off at the top. So for the various practical reasons, sometimes some of the plants are in the way to get mulch down. So you can also just cut the tops off and leave the roots in the ground. That's another option. There are a lot of factors, but it's just something to think about.
All right. We have another question specific to gardening. For a household garden, what effect does using chlorinated versus non-chlorinated water have? So I'm assuming this person probably lives in a town and is using city water. So what do you think?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. There's a lot of factors. So one of the resources that I did share, I think they can get to through the webinar, is an article on saline soils. So I would encourage you to look at that, which kind of helps explain what the salts, including chlorine, what that is and how that affects the soil. From personal experience, I've never had a problem with it. We water with city water here, and it's never been an issue, and it's chlorinated water. It may become more of an issue if you have high salts. We also use a drip line, and so it may be that if you were using an overhead sprinkler, it may be different than a drip line. I have never had an issue with it. I think the issues that I see with irrigation water here, whether it's on crops or in gardens, is more typically from a well that's extremely high in salts or sodium, or from an irrigation ditch. I've never really seen anybody here have issues with chlorine in the irrigation water in gardens.
Yeah, and if you do have problems, the more organic matter you have, the less problem you'll have.
Right.
To be able to buffer all of that stuff and a lot of other things that it's just those bugs do amazing things.
Great. All right. Okay, our next question, and I think cover crops has been mentioned, but someone wants to know, are some cover crops better than others?
Well,
Do you want to try that one, John?
Yeah, I'll start with it. You've got a lot on that. You've got a lot on all of this stuff. It depends on what you want to do. Now, if you want to have above ground mass, it's one thing. If you want to have root systems, that's another thing. It depends on what you're following the cover crop with. So if you're wanting to grow grain or a grass, it'd be good to precede that with a legume. And then after because that'll give you the nitrogen that grass needs, but it's also how you manage the legumes. So, but I'm a big fan of a polyculture cover crop that just has, I've used 20 or 30 different species of different families of plants, brassicas, legumes, grasses, things like amaranth, and I'm missing a couple of them here. But anyway, as diverse of a variety as you can, and then don't let them go to seed, because then all of the energy will have been in the seed. And some of them are good to leave standing. Some of them are good to chop and drop, leaving the roots in the ground. I think that's a really good practice for in the garden, and in the field if you can. But kind of a challenge there. And some of them, it depends on what you want. A cover crop for pollinators, that's another option. So it is getting clear on what you want, and sometimes that takes a while, but it's good to ask the questions for sure.
So there's in the resources there I shared, there's a very short article on garden cover crops. It's very short and very basic, but it gives you a few things to just start and experiment with. As John said, it can be very prescriptive. So you're looking at different types of plants, goals. So whether you want to fix nitrogen, you want to support pollinators, you need to suppress weeds, build organic matter. There are a lot of different factors. Then there's early season, late season, there's cold tolerance, there's heat tolerance, there's drought tolerance. So there are a lot of factors and it can be very prescriptive. There are two very good resources that I would recommend if you're interested in more. This one is by, both of these books are published by Western SARE, and they're both free as PDFs, or you can order them hard copy. And so I would really encourage folks, you can just do a search for Western SARE, or for SARE rather, S stands for Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, SAR, cover crops, and you'll be able to find these resources. And it allows you to go through and look at some of the different benefits of the different cover crops. The other thing to think about is the term cover crop. A cover crop is just a crop that's grown not to harvest, but to benefit the soil or provide some other ecosystem service. Leftover garden vegetable seeds can become a cover crop if you just throw them out late in the season and let them grow, right? Mm-hmm. So it can really be anything. I've been having fun sharing. I had a bunch of leftover seeds, piles of seeds that were donated I didn't have a use for, so I made a bunch of little packets of a mix of seeds and I sent them out to my friends for a chaos garden. And you just throw the seeds out there and see what grows. And then you harvest what you can, or leave some for the bugs or the birds or whatever, and it just doesn't have to be complicated. And I would say the same thing with the cover crops. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's really fun to increase the diversity. It's really fun to grow 10 or 15 different things and then try and identify them and see what's thriving. Different seasons, you may have a cold spring, a cold wet spring, or a dry spring, or a dry fall or a wet fall, and all the different climate conditions in each season. Different crops, cover crop species may thrive differently. And so when you have, the other advantage to having a diverse mix of species is that you kind of hope that no matter what the season does that year, what the weather does, you'll have something that will do well, right? It's really fun to see what pollinators come in, what different critters come in to eat the cover crops. So I would say experiment, and the biggest risk that I think of is going to be things going to seed and then becoming a problem, and then you wish you'd never planted it. But if you either plant things that are not very cold hardy, or they won't go to seed, or you manage carefully, there's really not a whole lot of risk. You just play with it and see what happens and what does well and what doesn't, and you're really only out the cost of seed, you know. Which can be significant if you're doing a large area, but I really encourage you just to experiment and try some things. And you can also do some intercropping, where maybe you plant some cover crops or some sort of soil cover between the existing rows of your crops or vegetables, whatever you're growing. You can grow up, you know, around perennials. There's a lot of ways to experiment and have fun with it, but just keep in mind that you can even just use whatever leftover vegetable seeds you have, or just experiment a little bit.
All right. A chaos garden. That sounds fun. That sounds fun. So we have another question.
And if you do
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, if you do the leftover garden seed, it's going to be annuals. And so going to seed, if it happens, it's not going to be as big a challenge as if you have perennials that are going to seed, because they can establish a real presence that you may not want.
Yeah. All right, we have a question about mulch. Can we use sawdust or wood chips as mulch?
Yes, so sawdust or wood chips can make great mulch. Straw, alfalfa hay is my favorite. Some moldy hay that you can get for free. Leaves, grass clippings, cardboard, shredded newspaper, wool. You can use wool. There's a lot of materials you can use for mulch. The thing about the very high carbon materials like wood chips, sawdust, pine needles, straw, is it should only be used as mulch and not incorporated into the soil, because remember all the microbes that I was telling you about earlier, they require carbon and nitrogen in a specific ratio, about 30-to-1. So they need about 30 units of carbon for every 1 unit of nitrogen that they eat. Well, if you incorporate all that high carbon material into the soil, the microbes are trying so hard to break all that down, they're using all the nitrogen in the soil in the short term, and the plants can't get to it. So you may have heard that when people say, don't put sawdust in your soil, it'll tie up your nitrogen. That's what's going on. But it's not a problem as a mulch. It's only a problem when you incorporate it into your soil. So wood chips, and there's some great videos and books out there about kind of deep litter or deep mulch gardening, lasagna gardening, wood chips, using heavy wood chips. So there's a lot of resources out there you can look up, and yes, those can be used for a mulch material.
Yeah, and there's a guy down in Laramie who is experimenting with gardening in wood chips mixed with biochar and compost, and a little bit of humates, and is having phenomenal results with that. And I'm going to be trying it this next year quite a bit, because and then it just gets better and better every year. But the advice to don't incorporate it in the soil if you're using either sawdust, which can get some compaction problems probably more than the wood chips, and the kind of wood chips like I prefer to have hardwood like or cottonwood or something like that rather than conifers. But if their conifers have a chance to cure, where a lot of the volatile hydrocarbons gas off and they're not in the wood chips anymore, then they work pretty well too, as far as I understand.
Okay. And I think we have time for maybe just one more question, but it's an interesting one. What is the function of lichens on native soils?
Oh, that's a fascinating one. I'm going to tell you everything I know, which is not very much, but it's really fascinating. So a lichen is maybe you already know this, a symbiotic association between I believe it's an algae and a fungi, I believe. Anyway, so there's a structure provided by the fungi, and then there's the photosynthesis and the process provided by the algae in there, I believe. So something like that. And if you look at some of these very, very fragile desert soils, you can see where that lichen is really what appears to be the only thing holding that in place. And you'll hear it called a biocrust or a soil crust sometimes. And that's where it's very important when you're out in the desert to watch where you step and to stay on trails or to stay where, you know, walk on rocks as best you can, particularly in those very, very fragile, thin soils. Take thousands of years for those crusts to form, and we can destroy them pretty quickly. And then you can see just then the dust just blows away. So that's my very limited understanding of that, but the biocrusts and the soil crusts are just fascinating, I think, and really, really important. There's also, I believe, some research showing that they are strongly competitive against cheatgrass, which is very important, of course, in the West with our with the invasiveness of cheatgrass, and so that those soil crusts can be helpful in preventing the infestation of cheatgrass.
Yeah, because the cheatgrass and the lichens are doing the same thing. They're covering the bare ground, and much more friendly to have the lichens than the cheatgrass. But the cheatgrass is also doing a very important, playing an important role in the succession of biology in the soil. And when we keep knocking the soil back to bare ground, cheatgrass is going to keep coming. There isn't much that can be done about that unless we start letting it do what it's meant to do, and then changing our plans to into a more advanced succession of plants, in my opinion.
Well, that was,
I'm happy to answer. If there's more questions, I'm happy to answer as many as, you know, I'm not in a hurry, so I don't know how many there are. But.
Yeah, me either. I'm happy to hang around.
yeah. So, well, I think actually we're about done with them, and we do try to keep these, you know, to a decent time. It will be available as a recording, and we will have it as a GoToWebinar records it. We will also put this on our YouTube channel. It will be on our website. You know, it will, we will make it available to people. And, but thank you so much, Caitlin and John. This was fascinating, and we just really appreciate your information, and, you know, just a wealth of information. Again, for participants, there were handouts. Those are very easily accessible. GoToWebinar sends those out as materials. And we do have one quick note we got from someone who sent us this. The Wyoming Food Coalition is working on a soil health initiative. It's being headed up by Professor Jay Norton at University of Wyoming. He's the lead. He's trying to develop this group to develop sustainable practices. They want as many people to participate as possible. We'll put the contact information in an email to all these participants. We'll email everyone with how they can get involved in that. But if that is something you are interested in, keep note of that.
Robin, is that an initiative for the legislature?
No, the Wyoming Food Coalition is a group of, and Powder River is one of the groups involved with that, but it was a bunch of local foods, ag organizations, farming and ranching organizations that came together about a year ago and said, we need food policy in Wyoming. Wyoming does not have a specific like food policy making or even advisory board or anything like that. So the Wyoming Food Coalition came together. They're still kind of coalescing, you know, getting together what they want to do. And I don't know if they're planning. I haven't heard any at this point if there's any legislation planned. But they're just trying to bring people together for some cohesion, and so people can really work, people who work on food can really work in coalition in Wyoming. So it's been great to see that. So, all right, our last slide, I'm gonna share that. You know, we'll have their contact information on it so folks can look at that. And if you want to follow up with questions for either John or Caitlin, you can. And again, watch for this. We will make this recording available. And we just thank everyone so much for participating tonight. Thank you both. Thank you all to the participants. We appreciate you spending your evening with us. So,
Thank you for the invitation.
right.
Thanks, Caitlin. It's great to be on the panel with you.
You too, John.
And thanks,
In person
Robin.
one of these days.
I really enjoyed being here.